In a word, Evan Osnos' latest book focuses on the subject of money. His book is titled The Haves and the Have Yachts, Dispatches on the Ultra Rich. There are 10 essays, which originally appeared in his home publication, The New Yorker. The oldest one, Survival of the Richest, ran in 2017. The newest, titled Land of Make-Believe, was published in 2024. In his introduction, Evan Osnos writes that, quote, reporting in the enclaves of the very rich, Monte Carlo, Palm Beach, Palo Alto, and Hollywood, is complicated. It's not a world that relishes scrutiny.
Think back to the moment you first saw democracy in action. Was it through your history teacher, a neighborhood activist, or a family friend who stood up for what's right? This summer, honor your own democracy hero on C-SPAN's Democracy Hero Wall and Fuel America 250 as we tell the story of America through unfiltered expert panels, live Revolutionary War reenactments, and profiles of our founders. Make a $25 gift or more by August 31st at cspan.org/donate, and we'll send you our exclusive Democracy Unfiltered decal. Keep history alive with your support. Head to cspan.org/donate now. Thank you.
Evan Osnos, I want to go to the chapter Land of Make-Believe, and I want you to tell us about Zach and Mallory Horowitz.
Zach and Mallory Horowitz were two young people who met in a little town in Indiana. They came together in college. They went to the University of Indiana, and they decided, after trying out a few different things, they were committed to the idea of making it big, and eventually it led them to Hollywood. And in Hollywood, Zach explained to his wife, Mallory, that he had this extraordinary opportunity where he was going to work for Howard Schultz, the tycoon of the coffee business, finding exciting opportunities, young entrepreneurs, and helping them succeed. And he began to make a huge fortune, as Mallory could see it. They began to live really like Hollywood royalty in a way, big fancy house with a cinema in the basement and a pool out back. And then one day, finally, strangely, the FBI showed up at their front door. And it turned out that Zach Horowitz had been running the largest Ponzi scheme in Hollywood history. And it was a tale of a kind of unraveling that, to me at least, Brian, came to represent something fascinating and quite broadly felt, I think, in our time, which is this idea of you fake it till you make it. It's a slightly poisonous creed. And I came to see in that story perhaps the purest expression of it that I'd ever seen.
What was it like in Indiana growing up?
Well, Mallory grew up in a town called Santa Claus, Indiana. She'd really never been far beyond the Midwest. She worked in Chicago for a couple years. But Zach lived on this very interesting border between being a regular Joe and being also from a rich family. And it was, the reason why I say it's an interesting borderland is that it showed him something. He came to enjoy the idea that he could be the richest guy in the room. He could be the benefactor. He was the one buying the pizzas for everybody. Or as they got a little older, he was the one who was investing in a sandwich shop, a juice bar. And he kind of got intoxicated by this idea that he could be a big deal. And I think what happens over time is it began to magnify. And, without telling the whole tale, I think what's pretty fascinating is that he decided at a certain point, I want to be a movie star. And so he discovered that he could use the money that he had, a bit from his family, and then a bit that was that he was beginning to bring in from this Ponzi scheme. And he could actually buy his way onto screen to the point that he began to be in movies with people that we've heard of, Brian Cox, who was the father in Succession, and people like Olivia Munn, and he was in a movie directed by Ralph Fiennes. And the strange thing about all this was that to a person, people who worked with him in the movie business said he was the worst actor they'd ever encountered. I mean, as one director who directed him said, he said it was a bit like directing a dead horse or a cardboard box. There was a strange emptiness about his persona on screen, but he was continuing to get these roles. And there was a way in which this story felt to me like it was a man who was determined to try to buy his way into the perception of success, even if the whole thing was based on a fantasy.
How'd you find him?
There was a news story in the LA Times about him being arrested, but it was a little, classic kind of case of a small story that had this curious and quite intriguing detail that he had been running this Ponzi scheme while also producing movies and becoming an actor. So I flew out to Los Angeles for his. It was there wasn't a trial because he had pleaded guilty. So I went out there for the sentencing. It was a little bit of a case, Brian. You know this kind of scenario as a reporter. You're looking at a story in the paper. You're saying, is it really, is it worth flying all the way out there for this? I don't know what I'm going to get. And so I show up at the courthouse in Los Angeles, and by sheer coincidence, I got there early, and I happened to get there right at the same moment that the defendant, was arriving at the courthouse. I think he'd gotten there very early because he was trying to avoid any cameras or reporters. But we find ourselves kind of going through the metal detector at the same time, and he passes through the metal detector. And I said, well, I was thinking to myself, this might be the only chance I'm going to have to talk to this person. So I said, look, I don't expect you to tell me anything. I know you're walking into your sentencing, but I just wanted to tell you who I am. I'm here. I'm a reporter from the New Yorker magazine, and I'm writing about this case. And I told him my name, and he just nodded and then walked off, and then was sentenced to 20 years in prison. And I watched this kind of over the course of that day kind of unfolding. And then months later, I was still working on this. I'd been talking to people who had been victims of this scheme, talking to people who'd known him, talking to his friends. And he was in prison and he hadn't talked to anybody. Anyway, I wrote him and I said, look, I've been working on this. I'm going to be writing about this, whether or not we talk or not. And he eventually he started writing back. And so I could start to communicate with him. And then I went to go see him in prison. And that made it possible to tell the story in much greater detail.
Where's he in prison?
He's in prison on the edge of Los Angeles, which is a kind of symbolically significant spot, I suppose, because he's almost now literally geographically able to glimpse the idea of what he was trying to achieve, but is, of course, out of reach.
Who got burned in the process that you might have talked to?
There was a large group of investors, and they stretched all the way from California to the Midwest and beyond. But the way it works, and this is often the case in a Ponzi scheme, is it's what criminologists call an affinity scheme, because it relies on trust and friendship. So very often people will start with the folks around them, like friends, or in his case, some of his first investors who ended up becoming part of the scheme and were in fact his roommates from college, and then their parents, and then their parents' friends, and it kind of widens out. And there's a very old piece of con man technology in a way, which is that people have been doing Hollywood schemes really since the very first movies, because there's just something inherently bewitching to people living far away. The idea that they could somehow find themselves in the movie business, clinking glasses with Tom Hanks, is just this completely entrancing possibility, and makes people engage in magical thinking. And they ended up giving him money, even though it wasn't clear why this guy, who was a kind of, by all descriptions, genial and fairly unremarkable mind, was somehow able to find an opportunity in Hollywood that all these professional movie people could not. Now, the answer in some ways tells us something actually about our perceptions of power and fortune in America, which is that the people who ended up giving money and losing money on this believed not that he had somehow hacked the system and found some brilliant new innovation. They felt that he had, just by luck, had befriended powerful people, and that they said to themselves, look, that's the way that money is made in America. That's how it happens. You meet the right person, you are roommates with the right person, you happen to bump into them and charm them at a party, and that's how you build a fortune. And in a way, I found that to be a kind of revealing mindset, because I think it captures a superficial fantasy of what it takes to succeed. And it's one that we see on social media every day. It's promoted in our pop culture, in our media. And he was both a consumer of that and a player. And he would promote these mythologies on social media of, him sitting at the Lakers games looking like he'd made it. And of course, on some level, he was living that life, except that it was all built entirely on deception.
Did you ever talk to Howard Schultz about how he was used in this process?
He did not talk to me, but he was emphatic through his people that he had absolutely never met this guy. It was a total and complete invention. This notion that he was tied up with Howard Schultz was totally false. But what's fascinating about it too is this is the power of the first impression, that Zach Horowitz told people early on in his life, in his professional life, that he had met Howard Schultz. He'd impressed him. Schultz had adopted him as a kind of mentee. And then that lie just was transmitted over the years from one group of friends to the next, And it became this idea, this sense that he just had the aroma of connections about it. And that was enough to make people suspend their judgment or their due diligence and just say, well, look. And I think, we do live in a time where, as crazy as it seems, you really can actually make a fortune by being friends with the right person. If you were, pals with a member of the Trump family or something else, these things can happen now. And in a way, he was leveraging that and managed to make off with close to $750 million, according to prosecutors, before it all came unraveled.
What happened to the people that loaned him the money? Did they get anything back?
Some of them lost everything. Some of and their stories are quite heartbreaking. I mean, some people wrote letters to the judge during the sentencing that said, for instance, in one case, a parent who had a child with special needs who had taken a big chunk of retirement savings, plowed it into this scheme, and now found it all gone. And the parent was now in retirement age, going back to work to try to support the family. In other cases, Ponzi schemes are curious things. And if you put money in the beginning, you can actually get your money back before it all falls apart. Famously, we know of the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme. But these are, in a way, a kind of perennial form of con, because they play on our emotions. And depending on when you get in and when you get out, you might actually even get out of there without losing a huge fortune, which then, of course, breeds a tremendous amount of distrust and anger among the various victims, because they feel as if some people were suffering more than others.
Did his wife divorce him?
She did, immediately, actually, right after his arrest, when it became clear that he'd been living a completely double life. She took their 2 kids, and her father bought her a plane ticket, and she flew back to Indiana, and they got divorced. I think, as is often the case in a unraveling like this, there were people in their world who said, how could you possibly not have known? How could you have lived with somebody who was leaving to go to meetings, for instance, late at night with business contacts. And it turned out, actually, that he had been using an app that could send him fake text messages. In fact, whole choreographed streams of messages that would make it appear that Howard Schultz or another big investor was urgently seeking his counsel and needed him to come to some place across town. It won't shock you to hear that he was, in fact, living a pretty awful double life. And I think there's so much about that tale that seized my attention because it felt so completely modern in its details. Things like the invention of text messages, the social media trafficking of fantasy and deception. And then at the same time, it is as old as the con itself. I mean, I remember in researching that story, I read a lot about in a way, the kind of metaphysics of the con man. And one of the great con men of all time, somebody who managed to sell the Eiffel Tower to unsuspecting buyers, not only once, but twice. And he said later, he said, the key to being a great con man is not being a great talker. It's being a great listener, figuring out what people need from you and then selling it to them.
I want to try this just as a little bit of a departure, and I'll get back to asking specific questions. Can you tell us, I don't know, pick a half dozen people that you interviewed and just tell us not the subject, the story, but the place where you met them and interviewed them? What were the circumstances of some of these?
Yeah, well, in some ways, I encountered people at moments that I didn't expect, and it ended up unlocking stories. I'll give you one example. I have to keep his name. Is a source who was confidential, but turned out to be quite revealing. I was on a plane. I don't usually talk to people. I mean, I don't know. We don't always talk to the people sitting next to us on planes, but I got to talking with the guy sitting next to me, and he was somebody who worked in San Francisco, worked in the technology business. And I don't cover technology as a business, but I said, what do you think doesn't get written about there that might be interesting? He said, well, what about people who are preparing for the end of the world? And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, you'd be surprised, but some of the most powerful people in Silicon Valley are in fact preparing for the apocalypse. And I kind of stashed that away and thought about it and started making phone calls over the course of the next couple of months. This was in 2016. And I never saw him in person again. I talked to him on the phone over the years since then. And he was right. In fact, there were people I discovered at the time, kind of to my astonishment, that in this place that is the most optimistic piece of the country in its own self-narrative, I mean, it's almost to the point of cliche where people in Silicon Valley talk about changing the world. But there were people there who were actively preparing for the idea of a social collapse, a breakdown in our society. I mean, then much of this was on the record, actually. A guy named Steve Huffman, who was the founder and CEO of Reddit, told me that he had gotten eye surgery in order to get rid of the need for eyeglasses or for contact lenses. And he'd also started stocking up on guns and ammunition and motorcycles and gold. He'd gotten his eyes fixed because he said, I don't want to have to depend on glasses in the event of a breakdown of society, of a world that they called without rule of law. And I just came to regard that as just one of those little pinprick moments of revelation where light suddenly kind of streams out of that little hole. And I got to get a sense of the churning, the anxieties beneath what is on the surface, a culture of tremendous wealth and power, but is in fact accompanied by this growing awareness of the fragility of society that in some ways has been fostered by the very platforms that these men, and they are in this case all men, have created.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute.
Where did you interview Mark Zuckerberg?
I've interviewed Mark Zuckerberg in several places, but most interestingly, perhaps in his home in Palo Alto. and he he was, frankly, Brian, kind of reluctant to do this. I had been pursuing the subject of an interview with Mark Zuckerberg for a long time. I mean, to the point of, as sometimes happens in interviews, like in when you're trying to write a profile of this kind, you reach the point where you say to the interviewee, or in many cases their vast teams of handlers, look, I'm going to be writing this piece whether or not this person talks or not. And that's a kind of point of reckoning. But in any event, he decided to do it. And I remember he opened the front door, and he had a kind of, I would say, a look of reluctant permission on his face that he's going to let this reporter come in and actually talk at length about the trade-offs, the decisions that he makes about speed and security, or caution and disruption. Here he is. He's arguably the most successful, certainly the richest entrepreneur of his generation. He is a person who founded, as we all know, a social media network in his dorm room, and then dropped out of college, and then built a company in his own orbit, picking his own advisors, his own lieutenants. And in fact, it is really so big, Meta now, what was then Facebook, there's no precedent in the history of commerce. I mean, it has more customers than Christianity, to put it one way. He has 2.2 billion people on the day that I interviewed him who are subject in one form or another to his decisions about what constitutes truth, what constitutes hate speech, what are the origins of violence, what is the value of connecting people across vast distances. And the thing that perhaps struck me most about the experience of being in his living room was that he had this huge pile of board games. And he's a big board game player. And I remember I went out and then started interviewing people about what's he like as a board game player, because you could learn something about what's his strategy. How does he do it? And somebody said to me, they said, Mark Zuckerberg isn't playing you in a game of Risk, for instance, or chess. He's playing you in a game of games. He's trying to figure out how your mind makes choices about the moves. And that struck me as an insight into his relationship with other people, and ultimately with these vast systems at his command.
Where did you interview Bill Gates?
No, I interviewed Bill Gates by phone, which I was glad to do. But I interviewed him on the subject of Mark Zuckerberg. And I thought there was an interesting moment in that process, because Gates, after all, when he was a young, rising entrepreneur, he too was regarded as perhaps a bit too confident. Perhaps, as he put it himself, he said, if you grow that fast, people are going to think you're arrogant. And Gates, we'll all remember, got into trouble with the federal government. Microsoft was accused of being a monopoly. It was a kind of grueling trial. And Gates, in his conversation with me, was making the case that Mark Zuckerberg should heed the lessons of Gates's own life, that perhaps there are moments when you do need to be less defiant in the face of what an elected government is asking of you. These are my words, not his. But that otherwise you could find yourself ultimately colliding with the state. And I thought and he said, he told me that he had encouraged Zuckerberg to hire a big Washington office, meaning essentially lobbyists and people who can get influence in government. And he said, and Mark owes me for that. I thought it was an interesting insight. And, what's fascinating to me now is there's been this passage of time since that interview. At the time, Mark Zuckerberg was fashioning himself very much in Gates's mold. He had just founded a giant philanthropy with his wife. He was starting to focus on things like giving away money to education and public health, very much trying to pattern himself after the generation of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, who, of course, had given tremendous amounts to charity, to philanthropic initiatives. And in the years since then, Zuckerberg has kind of moved away from the model that Gates pioneered. He is now much more politically and personally associated with the conservative movement, with Trump politics. We, of course, saw Mark Zuckerberg standing on that stage on Inauguration Day. and his philanthropy is now involved in fewer progressive causes than it was. And I think this is implicit, and I haven't heard this directly from Zuckerberg himself, but my reading, based on hearing how Mark talked about it to me back then and then watching him today, is that he sort of made a change in his life and decided that he was departing from that generation of the Gateses and the Buffetts, and is very much now consistent with a new generation of tycoons, much closer to Elon Musk and much closer to people in that mold, like and he is, of course, a major player in that.
You have 10 essays in this book, written over 8 years. One of those from 2022, and you, as a Chinese expert, can pronounce correctly Miles Guo's name. What's that story?
Yeah, that's a fascinating tale. The guy's name is Guo Wengui, and his last name is Guo in Chinese, and in English he uses the name Miles Guo. And he was a figure who I first heard about when I was living in Beijing. I lived there for 8 years. And he was almost a perfect product of this Wild West period in China. I was there from 2005 to 2013. He was a real estate tycoon who built this enormous complex on the edge of the Olympic Village. It was designed to be in the shape of a dragon, which was, of course, a kind of nationalistic symbol. He was a guy who seemed to have kind of perfected the formula of how to be a capitalist in a communist country. And then he had this spectacular downfall in China, where all of a sudden he's on the run. He had to leave the country because of a dispute. And it emerged in the course of this business dispute that he had been very close to the head of Chinese counterintelligence. And what was interesting and kind of revealing about that was there's always been this intermingling of financial power and state coercive power in China. That's been a feature of this period of the last generation of this enormous growth in wealth. And in leaving the country, he was on the run, essentially, because his patron, this intelligence chief, had lost out in an internal feud. And so this guy, Miles Guo, who eventually found his way to the United States, and the first thing he did when he got here was he plunked down the better part of $100 million on a penthouse at the top of the Sherry Netherland Hotel in New York. I mean, this incredible building. It's a very kind of brazen, prominent thing to do. And immediately starts assembling all the elements of what it means to be an American tycoon. He bought a yacht. He buys houses in Greenwich, Connecticut, and New Jersey, in addition to his penthouse. And then perhaps most importantly, or most tellingly, he figured out that if I want to make it in America, I need some friends in politics. And so he befriended Steve Bannon, and he begins to fund Steve Bannon's enterprise in one form or another, to the point that eventually, fast forward a bit, when Steve Bannon gets arrested for one of the criminal cases that he was contending with, he was arrested on the yacht owned by Guo Wengui, this admitted associate of Chinese intelligence. And I came to think of it, Brian, as this kind of window into the globalized way in which some of the elements of the big con. I'm not giving anything away to say Guo Wengui was eventually arrested and charged with a massive fraud. He's now awaiting sentencing, having been convicted of defrauding people out of a huge fortune. And Steve Bannon denied any wrongdoing, but what was amazing to me was that we used to think of the U.S. and China as having distinctly different cultures around wealth and power. I mean, could hardly imagine more different places. But what Guo Wengui discovered was that even a guy who comes to this country who really speaks very little English and had never spent much time in this country, that he was able to take a look at our landscape of influence, of access, and he figured out that he could use his money and buy his way into the very top ranks of power around the MAGA movement. I mean, he joined Mar-a-Lago. All of a sudden, he's sitting on a stage with people like Peter Navarro, who is now, of course, the architect of tariff policy in the Trump administration. And I won't tell the whole tale, or I'll leave a little out, but I'll just say that there was a great sense of mystery, and there still is, among China watchers and people in the intelligence community in the United States about who exactly Guo Wengui was working for. Was he, in fact, a dissident, as he framed himself, or was he something a little more complicated? Was he perhaps a kind of global citizen of his own loyalty, where he was playing the Chinese government and the U.S. government off each other and lubricating it all with his enormous wealth?
Where did he get his money?
Well, the most interesting piece of that is how it began, because he was a small-time thief back in a little town in rural China, and he went off to jail and came out of jail and had been, in a sense, kind of transformed. All of a sudden, he got a job working for a tycoon in Hong Kong as a low-level fixer doing things, and eventually moved his way up. And there's always been a theory, I can't say that it's confirmed, but that he is consistent, his life is consistent with a pattern that we do see, which is that in China, it's not uncommon for people who are at the border between the intelligence community and the sort of underworld, business underworld, that they'll adopt people who they think have promise. Oftentimes they'll adopt somebody in jail, and they'll say, all right, you're now what's known as a white glove in Chinese. A white glove is somebody who is the face, the outward arm of the people with real power, the ones who are actually taking a piece of the profits, but don't ever want to be publicly known. And from that, he built up this real estate fortune. I mean, he owned buildings, he built things. Then he came to the United States and continued to take that. He had billions of dollars by the time he got here. He was one of the richest men in China. And then he got here and he started promoting all kinds of things online, where he was appealing to the Chinese community to join clubs, and he got very involved in resistance to the COVID vaccine. It was all, in the end, Brian, a kind of vast architecture of belief, of playing on people's belief in him, that he somehow had the keys to a better life because he had made this fortune. And that's why I decided he was such a good subject, because he was the purest distillation I could ever find of somebody who was taking this era of enormous creation of wealth and was turning it into a brand, almost a self-justifying identity, and selling to people the fantasy that they could live like him, even when, of course, in the end, it all came unraveled.
A minor side story to this I picked up from your book was that you said he was able to get George Shultz and Henry Kissinger to his table for a dinner. And it struck me, I know you remember that in that whole Elizabeth Holmes story about Theranos, they were on his board and they got snookered there. So What is it about these big names in our history who get sucked into these frauds?
It's a great question. I think it has to do with the entrancing power of somebody with the magic touch. The idea that there are a chosen few who have this ability to build giant fortune, and that they, even when they might talk in terms that are kind of mumbo jumbo, in the case of Elizabeth Holmes, anybody who understood the science eventually concluded this thing doesn't make any sense. But you'll notice that a lot of the board members who she bamboozled were not specialists in the science. They were people who knew things about national security or foreign affairs, but they were drawn, I think, like moths, really, into the flames by the idea that they could be a part of this great tale of the building of fortune. And here they were then, as you rightly noticed, in Beijing, they would go and sit with Guo Wengui and hear him spin these yarns about, the China that he was helping to build. I am persistently interested in this idea of why it is that we suspend our judgment, our powers of disbelief. In some cases, these are people who have succeeded precisely because they're critical thinkers. You don't get to be George Shultz or Henry Kissinger by being a dupe, but they find themselves essentially their powers of critical thinking fail them. They almost willfully suspend them in the face of enough money that can seem as if it explains itself. And that's a pattern we see over and over. I mean, not to get explicitly political about it, but I think one of the mysteries of our time is how it is that Americans who are, in some cases, quite frustrated by their own economic circumstances might look at a presidential candidate and say, that's somebody who understands my life. They can relate to me, even though he's the son of a real estate family from New York City.
For years, I've known only at the interview table a man named Bill Gertz. And he was for years with the Washington Times. And you write him up in here, being with the Free Beacon and misstepping or taking money from Guo. Explain that.
Yeah, when Guo came to the U.S., he established himself really by just, in effect, announcing this identity as a dissident from China. And this was a really appealing idea in the China analysis world, because where I spent some of my time, because the idea that there might be a dissident who had actually really hit the highest levels of Chinese society, meaning he really understood where the money was being made and stashed and stolen, and was then perhaps coming out and willing to tell those stories. That was a very important prospect. And for that reason, in the very beginning of Guo's time in the US, a lot of serious China analysts said, well, let's listen to what he has to say. And partly it was that he was purporting to have documents that could be explosive if true. These were internal documents from Chinese government ministries that suggested, for instance, that some of the most powerful people in China, like a guy named Wang Qishan, who was one of the important economic czars, had stolen huge fortunes and stashed them overseas. And this was, and that ended up, that story was never confirmed, and it was denied, and so on. And a lot of these documents ended up being proven to be false. In fact, if you spoke to people who had spent their career studying these kinds of documents, Americans, former intelligence officials, they said to me, we could tell immediately that these were fraudulent. But part of the nature of disinformation is that you mingle real documents with fake documents. You, in a sense, kind of throw sand in the eyes of the observer, make it hard for them to figure out what's real. Bill Gertz, at one point, who was well known in the world of China-related journalism in Washington, ended up essentially being paid by Guo Wengui, and that ended up leading to his departure from the Washington Free Beacon. But it was an important indicator of how Guo was using his money to establish himself in Washington. And that is part of a pattern. And frankly, it ties into the same pattern we saw in the case of that Hollywood con man, Zach Horowitz, which is that when people began to see that Guo Wengui was showing up, he seemed to know all the right people. He seemed to be treated with great seriousness by China analysts. It wasn't all that different from this con man saying he was pals with Howard Schultz. There's a way in which I've come to think of the power of the first impression as being really a diabolical fact in these stories of fortunes, both real and false, because if you are introduced to somebody and you're told that this person is really well dialed in, that they really have access to some of the most discerning and intelligent and successful entrepreneurs in the world. You treat them differently than if they show up empty-handed. And this is a prime example of that.
Well, one last thing on the Guo story. He created a media company, and every day in this town now there is a program podcast by Steve Bannon. How much did Bannon benefit, and how much did he pay for keeping this war room going?
When Bannon was in dire straits, essentially he'd been fired from the White House during the first Trump administration. His first important patron, which was the Mercer family, Robert Mercer, and who, of course, was a conservative donor, had kind of cut him loose. And it was at a crucial moment when Bannon might have actually, in a sense, kind of faded away. And that's right at the moment that he was introduced by Bill Gertz, in fact, to Guo Wengui. And Guo paid Bannon millions. He hired him on a contract that would be kind of a nebulous assignment of media advice of some kind. Now, the irony about all this was watching these two. They couldn't really communicate particularly well to each other. Guo speaks heavily accented English. It's a kind of sort of self-taught patois. And Bannon, of course, doesn't speak Chinese. But they saw something in one another, is how I came to perceive it, watching the two of them together and over all of these videos they made, that they were both almost a kind of primal fighter. They believed that politics was a form of blood sport, and that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so here you had these two people with very, very, I mean, after all, let's remind ourselves, Steve Bannon fashions himself as the enemy of the Communist Party and the warrior against the People's Republic. And here he was now in business with a man who was, until about 5 minutes before, a arm of the Chinese intelligence world. It was a strange alliance, and ultimately a toxic alliance, and it all fell apart. But I think along the way, Bannon provided Guo with ideas about how to have influence in the U.S. political system. And Guo ended up using his followers. He had this huge network of people that he had attracted online, and they amplified a whole range of false stories about Democrats and about Chinese dissidents. This was one of the signs that it became clear, well, maybe this guy really is not a dissident, because he was turning his followers, in some cases, almost physically, against some of the most prominent dissidents in this country, having his followers go to their houses and taunt them and hold protests in front of their front door. So it was, in a way, Guo became the perfect image, I thought, the kind of perfect expression of this era in which money and social media and influence and politics are all stirred together in this very powerful and quite dangerous stew.
Did you meet Guo?
Guo never met me. I tried over the course of months, and he never consented to an interview. Towards the end of the process, it got quite hostile, actually, and his people got quite aggressive, and they began to promote a propaganda campaign online. It was kind of fascinating to watch, in which they said I was a Communist Party agent. They doctored up photos that made it look as if I'd been beaten up. It was sort of, I mean, frankly, I never took it all that seriously. I'm not a Communist Party agent, and I hadn't been beaten up, but it was amazing to watch, and frankly, a little unnerving, Brian, to be on the receiving end of something that was clearly had been whipped up in an instant. And all of a sudden, I mean, hundreds, if not thousands, of messages a day that were denouncing me, and it was the first time I'd ever seen the real ferocity of how somebody with the money to build a community of followers can generate a fervent devotion to the point that eventually, when that devotion was turned on a reporter, it was pretty unnerving.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute.
I always get a kick out of journalists who do the following. That's you. And it always means something. In your piece called Ruling Class Rules, you start off by saying, as a young man in his 80s, Tucker, Swanson, McNear, Carlson set out to claim his stake in the establishment. It's the use of all four names. Why did you do that?
Well, in that particular case, the name Swanson is a skeleton key that tells you a lot about Tucker Carlson, the man we usually think of as Tucker Carlson. And that's because the name Swanson, his middle name, was given to him by his stepmother, who was an heiress of the Swanson food fortune. And what's important about that was Tucker Carlson grew up with, in the first part of his life, a sort of natural claim to what he presented to the world. He wanted to be seen with his bow ties and his kind of old school preppy ways. He wanted to be seen as a figure of the establishment. I mean, in a way, he was asking to be described as an elite, and he gloried in it. I mean, that was what he wanted. And, you know, he liked to tell stories about the fact that he had gone to a private school in Rhode Island, and then he had failed actually to get into any colleges. But as he liked to tell the story on himself with a kind of, I would say, a sort of preppy, insouciant quality. He'd say, well, my girlfriend's father was the headmaster, and he made a phone call and got me into Trinity College, which is where he went. And he ended up, then he tried to go to the CIA, and he was rejected, but he found his way into the media business. And the reason why I found that name so important was Tucker Carlson eventually fell out with the establishment in this country. And he went from being the bow tie wearing, self-described product of the Northeastern elite and repositioned himself as a counter elite, a kind of person who was seeking to tell truths about how power was really practiced behind closed doors. And that is a very interesting turn in American history. It's something that actually is quite revealing if you know what the history of elites and counter elites can suggest.
You have a paragraph I want to read in that same chapter. And I actually thought about it in light of the fact your father has spent so much time explaining Vietnam. And you say conservatives tapping into the decline of public trust in authority since Vietnam and Watergate turned the government, the media, Wall Street, and the Ivy League into the swamp, the fake news, and the globalists and the ivory tower. The elite became whoever is peering down on us, judging us, manipulating us.
In a way, I think we're living through a period of a collapse of confidence in major institutions, and we see this across the board. And you could trace that story to a lot of points of origin, but you have to point, perhaps at the beginning, to the war in Vietnam. That there was a group of people who came of age in this country, a generation or two, who believed that their government had lied to them, and they were right about that. You're kind of mentioned my dad. He's written about the role of Robert McNamara, who had been Secretary of Defense in the Johnson administration and had originally in the Kennedy administration. And McNamara was part of that deception, part of, in effect, lying to the American public about a war that he'd already decided was unwinnable. And the product of that deception, followed by Watergate, in which you had a U.S. president using the powers of the presidency to try to crush his enemies and ensure his own survival in politics. I think if you follow that forward, there was also, of course, the war in Iraq, which was also predicated on a deception, the idea that there were weapons of mass destruction in that country. And the result is that we've seen this steady corrosion of what used to be called elite credibility, the notion that there were a group of people who had devoted themselves to public service and done the hard work of educating themselves and were ultimately devoted simply to doing the people's business. I think that idea, if we want to understand how that idea got so degraded, we have to look at those moments as the key points in the chronology. I would point out an interesting fact just caught my eye this week, Brian. We're talking here shortly after the mayoral primary in New York City, and in which a candidate who had started polling at 1% in the beginning of the race, Zoran Mamdani, ended up beating Andrew Cuomo, of course, much more established in the minds of the public. And what really caught my attention was that Mamdani was endorsed by neither the New York Times nor the New York Post. And he still managed to win, which is a small but telling sign of the way in which the voices of authority, what constitutes elite authority, has really kind of liquefied. And we're at this strange moment when a podcaster like Joe Rogan, or somebody who, frankly, a lot of Americans have never heard of, can end up having a gravitational effect on a race or on our politics that is at least as important as what a major institution like a big newspaper used to be about.
You work for a publication called New Yorker, which is owned under the umbrella of Condé Nast, which is owned by the Newhouse family.
Right.
Have you ever thought, in thinking about money, turning the spotlight on the mega billionaires that own your company?
Well, there is a saying that goes around in the world of people who study wealth, which is that when you start poking around, it turns out that almost everybody, whether they like it or not, ends up working for a billionaire, because that's the world that we are in right now. In some cases, it's a for-profit enterprise. In other cases, it's a nonprofit. They may have a chairman or a chairwoman who has an idea of how they want to use their fortune. In my case, I haven't done any work on the subject of the Newhouse family, but it is a fair subject and it's a fair topic. I think it's a precarious reality that some of our oldest and most distinguished media organizations right now, whether we're talking about the New Yorker or the New York Times, which of course is owned by the Sulzberger family, majority owned, I should say, and controlled, that we do operate at the whim of a few powerful families. And we've seen the perils of that. Jeff Bezos, who bought the Washington Post when he was married to Mackenzie Scott and was at a very different moment in his life, seemed to be kind of angling for the reputation as a civic figure, has gone through a pretty dramatic evolution now to the point where he has ordered his editorial page to promote only stories about free enterprise and personal liberties, and he's appearing on stage with Donald Trump. So, I quake a bit at the idea that there could come a day when the billionaire who runs the company could say, well, from now on, we only want to write about this or that. And that's a decision point.
Now, this subject is going to sound dry and dull, but it's not. It's complicated. Marlena Sohn, wealth managers, Kendall Getty, Alexandra Getty, Gordon Getty.
Yeah.
What is that chapter about?
That chapter was a kind of an amazing thing that came along and afforded me a view I never really thought I would ever get, which is the world of private wealth management. This is an entire industry which a few people know very well and most people know not at all. And this is the world that is designed to build and perhaps more importantly, preserve the fortunes of families that are on the verge of or have entered into what's known in the business as dynastic wealth. And there's a saying in the private wealth management world, which is that the whale that never surfaces doesn't get harpooned, which is to say, there's a reason why we don't hear much about the private wealth industry on the front page, because they don't want to get much attention. But there was a case of a private wealth manager named Marlena Son, who was hired by some heirs of the Getty family, which is one of the wealthiest clans in the country. John Paul Getty had been the richest man in the world in the 1950s, and his descendants are still living with tremendous fortune. And some of them hired a wealth manager who helped them make investments, and then there was a big falling out. And they accused her of abusing her position. She accused them of avoiding taxes in violation of California law. Each side denied all of the charges. But as a result, there was this elaborate detail in the court filings that allowed us to be able to describe the relationship between a family, in this case, these daughters of the Getty family, and their decisions about where to spend their time and where to pay taxes and how to minimize their taxes, what was legal, what was illegal. And here's the key point, that in some ways, these daughters had wanted to be seen, and they thought of themselves personally as close to the kind of cultural phenomenon of the left. And they, in some cases, perceived themselves and described themselves as fans of Bernie Sanders. But according to their former wealth manager, they were also involved in a family trust in which they were taking advantage of some of these esoteric details of the law that would allow them to save hundreds of millions of dollars, and meaning that they would not go into the public treasury. And it kind of created a bit of a laboratory for looking at these questions, which is how much does a wealthy family of heirs and the children or grandchildren or great grandchildren of the original person who made the fortune, what are their responsibilities? And is there a collision between wanting to be perceived as a progressive political person while at the same time making choices to prevent paying taxes that might otherwise be applied for the kinds of progressive causes that you want to be associated with?
How hard was that chapter to write?
That was a very difficult piece, because what really was the goal was, let's write about the American tax system that has some perversities in it. Look, all of us could rely on a few things in our lives, right? Death and taxes, as the saying goes. But there are ways in which, if you have the right kind of advisors and you have enough money to be able to move the pieces around, you can pay much less in tax than you might otherwise. I'll give you a couple of examples. According to ProPublica, during the pandemic, 18 billionaires in this country were able to minimize their tax burden so much that they actually qualified for a stimulus check because they were officially making so little in income. I mean, Jeff Bezos, even though he was a billionaire many times over, according to ProPublica, even qualified for a child tax credit, which is actually reserved for people at the middle and bottom of the income scale. And that's because there are some tried and true techniques which are frankly not really available or known to the vast majority of the public, but are well known to a tiny sliver of Americans, that allow you to avoid income in the first case. And we have an income tax in this country. We don't have a tax on wealth. What that means, that almost sounds, we all hear these words, they kind of wash over us like political talk. But in practical terms, what that means is that if I'm somebody who's sitting in a house that has a Matisse painting on the wall and a pile of gold bullion on the table in front of me and a super yacht parked outside, I actually can pay less in taxes than a 8th grade social studies teacher who's taking home $50,000 a year, because I can engineer it so that I don't have any income. And that's frankly, I think to a lot of people, it doesn't pass the common sense test. And that's why there are, in fact, now a growing number, small, I will admit, but a growing number of wealthy Americans who say, this doesn't make any sense. If we're trying to lay the foundation for a prosperous century ahead, we need to start coming up with some more common sense ways of ensuring that our country is funded at the level it should be.
This note jumped out at the page from this chapter, and I just wonder where you found this. He said that JFK personally leaked to Newsweek the aggressive tactics of J. Paul Getty when it came to avoiding taxes. How did he and why did he personally leak that?
You're, as always, Brian, you're the closest of readers. You found a wonderful little tale in there, which is that John Paul Getty was ferociously devoted to avoiding paying taxes. He lived much of his life in the United Kingdom while purporting to be a California resident. And in California, he said, of course, no, I live in the United Kingdom. So he was constantly engaged in this process of minimizing his tax burden. And it got to be so brazen. At one point, he paid, off the top of my head, I'll get the numbers wrong, but he was paying very small quantities of tax, hundreds of dollars a year, for instance, in some cases. And JFK was offended by this. Frankly, he just said, this is no way. JFK knew a thing or two about big money, came from a very wealthy family. And he just thought that this determination to avoid paying any taxes ultimately leads the country down a dangerous path. And Kennedy, you might recall, Brian, was very close to Ben Bradlee, who at that point was working in the Washington bureau of Newsweek, eventually went on to become the famous editor of the Washington Post. But the details around Getty's tax returns made their way into the hands of Ben Bradlee and eventually into Newsweek, and it was quite a scandal of its time.
Another tidbit in doesn't mean that much, but it did to me, that sales of recordings of music peaked in 1999. I'm sitting upstairs with tons of CDs, and nobody wants them.
Well, it's in a way, those CDs are now they're sort of a tombstone to a period in our cultural economy, because when those CDs went away, for all of us who, are music consumers, you and I, we can now choose, do you play the old CD or do you stream it online? Doesn't make much difference to us, but it actually makes a huge difference to the artists. I've spoke to a lot of musicians in writing this book because I was interested in what's happened to the way that we pay for our cultural patrimony, our incredible innovations of music and art. And one of the strange and kind of overlooked realities is that if you were a musician, you used to, on a CD where somebody would go in and spend $15 in the store, you would take home several dollars for that. It wasn't a huge fortune, but it was enough to make a pretty good living. And as one musician said to me, I went from getting royalties checks on these physical sales of enough to live on to now getting, he gets a fraction of a dollar, sometimes even fractions of a cent for streaming one of his songs. And at the same time, the music industry has transformed so much that until recently, the biggest vendor of physical music in America was Starbucks, because it was the last place you could ever buy a CD practically. So, and the reason I wrote about that was, it's not like the money disappeared. The money went elsewhere. It just has now gone into the hands of the platforms, the streaming platforms like Spotify and elsewhere, instead of as much going into the pockets of the actual creators. And that has all kinds of strange effects on how those musicians choose to spend their time, their lives, their careers. And I wanted to write about that because, in a way, this whole book, Brian, was like a process of simply wanting to document in as much detail and as vividly and, frankly, as much fun as possible what happened when money became so vast and concentrated into the hands of of some very distinct and identifiable powers in this country. What did that do to the country, and what did it do to the world? And it turned out some of the tales were quite remarkable.
Those Starbucks CDs are fabulous. I'm sorry they went away. They were great. What can you tell us about your next book, if anything?
Well, I've decided to keep quiet on the details, except I can give you a bit of a hint, which is that after writing now about the present day, I've done 4 books about the world we live in, on China and the United States, about people who are in the cut and thrust of now. I've decided I need to go spend some time in the archives. I'm going to write about a chapter of history that is of tremendous interest to me. And my hope is that by going into the archives for a little while and, putting on those white gloves and closing the door, that I might be able to write about something that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And these days, there's so much that feels uncertain. I think there might be lessons for us in finding a story that's already resolved.
You and Sarah Beth Berman have been married how many years?
We've been married since 2012, and we've been together now for 17 years. And
how old are the children?
They're 9 and 7.
How would you describe them?
Well, my oldest is on his way tonight to perform in a play about SpongeBob, and he's been working on it all week. He's nervous as hell. I think he's going to knock him dead. And then my 7-year-old is a dancer who takes after her mother, clearly not after her father. But these are 2 cultural creatures, and we're very lucky to have them in our house.
The current book we're talking about is The Haves and the Have Yachts. And you and I didn't even talk about the yachts. The dispatches on the ultra rich. Evan Osnos, thank you very much.
My pleasure, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Book Notes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.